since I took some time for myself this week, a story from my past that would probably no longer be possible now. Perhaps the craziest and most stressful 3 days of my tennis career. Let's go back to 1990. I was a young tennis pro, ranked between 200 and 300 in the ATP rankings. I spent 4 weeks in the Netherlands and played a so-called satellite, the predecessor of the current future tournaments. During my stay in the Netherlands, I found out that I had to go to Brazil immediately after the end of the tournaments there. There were 2 challenger tournaments in Brazil, and to my surprise, I was in the main draw. So I wanted to take the advantage of this opportunity. Back then, of course, all trips were booked through a travel agency. When I booked the trip, I was informed of the entry requirements for Brazil, and this caused me a bit of a problem. The passport must be valid for at least 6 months when entering Brazil, and this was not the case for me. So I had to go to my hometown of Graz in Austria to get a new passport. A satellite back then was played over 4 weeks in one country. I was already in the 3rd week when I was faced with the problem of the passport. So it was clear to me that I had to go to Graz between the 3rd and the 4th week to pick up the new passport. My father arranged an appointment for Monday at 9 a.m. when the office opens. Of course, I then played the doubles final in the 3rd week. On Sunday evening, after the final, I got in my car and drove the 1,150 kilometers to Graz, a journey that took over 11 hours. So I arrived in Graz on Monday morning. I still had time to sleep for 2 hours, and then I went back to the office to pick up my new passport. Then, what a surprise, I got back in the car and drove 11 hours back to the Netherlands. I arrived on Monday night, played my singles match on Tuesday, and again, surprise, surprise, I lost. I was successful in the doubles this week and reached the final. After the final, I got back in the car and drove 11 hours to Vienna to fly to Brazil the very next day. Let's not forget, it was the time before the internet. I had a piece of paper from the ATP with a map of the tournament venues in Brazil. And my destination was the town of Campos, or Campos dos Goitacazes, to be precise. I then flew from Vienna to Sao Paulo on Sunday, where I landed on time on Monday morning. The Challenger tournament started on the day I arrived in Brazil. As I had been competing in the Netherlands for so long, I got a Tuesday start for my first round. I had a domestic flight from Sao Paulo to Campos in the morning. I arrived at the very small airport in Campos around noon and wanted to go straight to the tennis club to practice on site. I got into the only cab at the airport and the driver took me to the tennis club. We finally reached the club in Campos. The driver stopped and I was, to put it politely, astonished. I was standing in front of a tennis club where there was no sign of a tournament, and on top of that, the entrance door to the club was locked. Of course, I thought the driver was taking me to the wrong club. However, he denied the question of whether there was another tennis club in this town. I would describe myself as a calm person, but at that moment my heart rate increased rapidly and I tried to avoid panicking. I tried to put the situation into perspective and think clearly. One thing was clear. I was lost in Brazil. Who can help me? My answer was a local travel agency. I asked the cab driver to take me to the nearest travel agency. After a short drive, we arrived at the travel agency. I paid for the cab, took my luggage, and entered the office. Two friendly ladies looked at me curiously and my question, if they spoke English, was answered positively. I explained my situation to them, and it was of course not common for them to find a lost European. We decided to call the Brazilian Tennis Federation, and one of the ladies found out the phone number. A short time later, she was engaged in a conversation. I didn't speak Portuguese, and so I just had to wait and see. After the lady hung up, she looked at me and said she had good and bad news for me. The good news was that she knew where my destination was. The bad news was that it was about 800 kilometers away. The place is called Campos do Jordão. Fortunately, the ladies knew how I would get there. Back to the plane to Sao Paulo, there to the bus station, and then by bus for about 3 hours to Campo do Jordão. It was now Monday, early afternoon, and I had to be there the next day to play my match. Luckily, there was a flight from Campos to Sao Paulo in the afternoon, and I booked the flight, paid for the ticket, thanked the ladies, and shortly afterwards was once again in a cab on the way to the airport. The driver took me to the airport. I got out, paid, and once again stood in front of a locked door. After the cab driver drove off, I found myself in front of a medium-sized house and lots of green fields. There was a bench in front of the building. I sat down, stared at the fields, and was alone with myself and the world. After the stress of the last few days and the shock of my arrival, it was nice to have some time and peace. After a while, I had to laugh inside. The situation was so bizarre. I was sitting on a bench outside an airport in the middle of nowhere, and I was alone. I thought I would tell my children about it one day. I had no idea in 1990 that it would happen on YouTube. I also had no idea that it wasn't the end of the story, so I was able to enjoy the moment to some extent. After a while, I saw a man on a bicycle slowly approaching the airport. As he rode past me, he looked at me in slight surprise and then disappeared behind the building. A few minutes later, the door to the airport was unlocked by this man. This obviously meant the airport was now open. Then a few more passengers arrived, and finally I found myself on a small plane heading for Sao Paulo. Today it would be unimaginable, but the pilots of the small plane didn't close the door to the cockpit, so I could see that after just 30 minutes we reduced our altitude and finally landed. I was a bit surprised about the small airport. After consulting the flight attendant, I found out that it was a stopover and there would be one more stop before we reached Sao Paulo. We were only 6 passengers in total on this small plane. 2 of them got off at the first stop, and then we took off again. The door to the cockpit was still open. After a short flight, I saw a huge thunderstorm front appear in the direction we were flying. A short time later, it was already getting uncomfortable on the plane. We were preparing to land. The plane was exposed to strong winds. The rain was lashing down on the windshields, and I saw the pilots struggling to keep the plane under control. It was an anxious few minutes until we finally landed, and the relief was evident on everyone's faces. 3 other passengers got off, so that I was the only passenger left on the plane. After about 10 minutes, I saw the pilots in the cockpit switching off all the instruments. The flight attendant came to me and said that unfortunately we couldn't fly any further today, because there was a massive thunderstorm front that would last even longer. But, again good news, the airline would pay for my hotel and dinner. The departure for the next day was scheduled for around 8 a.m. As I had no alternatives, I had to accept the offer. At the hotel, I called the supervisor of the tournament and he said he would schedule me as the last match for tomorrow. It became more and more of a race against time for me. I was no longer interested in being prepared for this match. My only goal was to be there on time. If I missed the match, I had to pay a fine, no prize money, and the hotel wasn't paid for either. That would have been very painful for my financial situation. The hotel was okay. The dinner was with the crew of the plane, and my story was of course very interesting and, at least for them, amusing. The next morning, the sky was clear and the last flight to Sao Paulo went smoothly. When I arrived in Sao Paulo, I immediately took a cab and drove to the Rodovario do Tietê bus station. At the bus station, I bought a ticket to Campo do Jordão. I had to wait about an hour for the next bus, and then it was about 3 hours to my destination. I finally arrived in Campo do Jordão at around 4:30 p.m. I would soon find out if my race against time had been successful. After a short cab ride, I arrived at the tennis club, and this time there was clearly a tournament in progress. Hopefully with me as a participant. With my bags, I ran as fast as I could to the supervisor's office and reported to be finally here. The supervisor looked at me and pointed to a tennis court where a match was going on. He said, "That's your match. It started 15 minutes ago and the lucky loser is already playing." This made me realize that I had lost without playing a match. I had lost the battle against time. So, I was one story richer in my life, but poorer for the prize money in this tournament. As the mistake wasn't just mine, I had a piece of paper from the ATP with the wrong information on it. The ATP refrained from fining me for not competing. The tournament organizer also felt sorry for me and paid for a couple of nights in a hotel so that the financial loss was limited. However, there was one winner from this whole situation, and that was the lucky loser who got my spot. José Dayer from Brazil made pretty good use of this chance and reached the final after all. He also thanked me in his speech at the award ceremony. So I was still a topic at the final after all. While researching my story, I also went back to the official ATP website, and the name of the place was still very unclear with Campos. So be careful. Don't get lost in Brazil.